I'll get some sound here. Could we have roll call, please?
Commissioner Bennick, Commissioner Hoyler,
Here.
Commissioner Keating,
Here.
Commissioner Purvey, Commissioner Smith,
Here.
Vice Chair Chapman,
Here.
Chair Summers.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Could we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do we have a current events report?
Oh yes, Chairman, members of the Commission, on March 16th at the City Council work session, the Urban Forester from the City of Phoenix, Mr. Richard Atkins, will be giving a presentation kind of on the regional urban tree shade plan. This is going to kick off kind of the discussions of, trying to create some kind of tree plan for the city of Surprise as well. And that's it. And also, the Commission is definitely invited to join in.
When is that?
May 16th at 4. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, me.
Next item is consideration and action on the April 2nd, 2015 Planning and Zoning Commission minutes.
I move to approve.
Please vote.
Looking for one more vote?
That be it?
No. Let's see. Motion passes, 5 yes votes.
Thank you. Next item is a public hearing, and it's consideration and action on 2 alternative approaches to land use concerns for the city's initiated major general plan amendment, general plan element update.
Thank you. Chair and members of the Commission, just to give you kind of the background, I believe in November we had a discussion about kind of going a different way with our village planning process. As part of that, we took what we were doing in our Village 5 contract, we worked it out with the contractor to basically amend the scope of work to do a major general plan amendment, which we'd look at multiple elements within our general plan, including land use, circulation, economic development, and open space, parks and open space, and the implementation section. As part of that, one of the main components is the land use piece. So tonight we'll kind of be presenting some of the alternatives that have kind of come through the process that we've looked at, specifically for how we're going to address land use and future land use within the City of Surprise. So again, the purpose of this work session is to introduce, compare, and receive Commission input on 2 potential approaches to land use planning. The intent is to develop one preferred alternative, and that preferred alternative could be one or the other, or maybe a mixture of both. We're trying to get some input by the Commission that will then take to the Council as well. We will be presenting this to Council at the next Council meeting on a public hearing, and part of the presentation will kind of be the Commission's input of what they would like to see. So what we're going to do is kind of go through some of the conventional and more character area. Conventional traditional is basically where you take every, not necessarily parcel, but every area of your city, kind of plan it out appropriately. An example of this is the City of Phoenix, where when you start looking at the City of Phoenix general plan, you can see every commercial corner, every piece is kind of designated something specific. So when a developer comes in, it's basically here's what you need to do on this corner to gain our approval, or you need to go in and amend the plan. And then what we're going to do is show you kind of where we have another city where we have an example, the City of Chandler, where it's more of kind of a character and mixture of character conventional, to where you have your areas, but when you start looking at your designations, such as when you look at residential, the residential component also has commercial located into it, and basically says that you need to have commercial that's going to serve that residential. So as opposed to planning out every individual corner, you actually give a little leeway for the city and the developers and the property owners to kind of work together to come up with some kind of solution for those areas when they come in for development. And then we have another example with the city of Goodyear, which is very much more of the character area, where again it's designed as here's your areas of what type of intensity of development, and then the pieces of commercial, residential, and so forth are worked out through that process. So kind of going back to the city of Chandler's plan, as you can see, when you look at the residential component, you have some commercial components to it. They also identify, if you look at their major thoroughfares, such as Alma School, Dobson, so forth, those corners are kind of designated that they should have kind of some kind of regional commercial type concept in there, so that you get that mixture of residential and commercial that you need to help support. And then you look at the areas where you have specifically designated that as employment areas that are going to be employment generators that are for the community. And on top of that, what they also do is they have some areas specifically talking about kind of special areas that they talk about planning, such as their kind of suburban, the Southeast Chandler Park area, which is more suburban, rural oriented, and then up to near their air park, where it's more heavy types of employment. So kind of taking a little close-up of that, as you can see, what they've done is they've hashed those areas as areas of specific planning that would go on. And this is one of the concepts that we're kind of throwing into the surprise plan, that we don't want to plan out every nook and cranny, but we know there's certain areas within the city that we need to do some real hard looks at, and that we need to get more into the fine-grained planning of those areas. Areas such as the OTS, areas such as the White Tanks kind of interface, areas such as the Prasada Development 303 corridor, and then the areas in and around Lucox 1. And then you have kind of approach where there's a little bit of both. The city of Scottsdale actually does this. So they have kind of a future land use plan, but then they have character types, and you use those together to try to define what your future land use is going to be. So this is kind of an example of something that's kind of a hybrid between each. This hasn't been adopted by the city of Scottsdale, but this is another example of how these different types of land use planning approaches could work together, or how that one can complement the other. Mm-hmm. With that said, I'm gonna bring up John Vlaming, who's one of the consultants on the project. John.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. Appreciate the foundation there relative to what some of the other communities are doing. Now we'd kind of like to take it and how does it apply to the city of Surprise? So we can kind of transfer and talk about some of those concepts, and then how do they apply to the geography that's unique to Surprise itself. So what you see on your screen is, I guess what we did was looked at three approaches. One is kind of what we'll call the base case, which is your existing land use plan, using that for a comparison and contrast. The other is a conventional approach. How would we take that and kind of carry that forward and make it better? And then the character area, like Eric had described, in terms of utilizing some of the approaches that these other communities have done, but really tailor it to the Surprise area. So kind of working back and forth across the column. The conventional is similar to the existing plan, but again, looking for more enhancement. The character area is a more recent approach that's been undertaken by a number of these communities that have been engaging in their general plan process. But again, in our particular case, our geography is different, environment's different, the transportation and open space systems are different. So you have to kind of apply those where they're needed. The conventional tends to be more prescriptive. You know, you have a number of land use categories that you all are aware. You know, 5 or 6 different categories for residential. You know, in the new case, you might have 2. And so the conventional approach is much more prescriptive than the character area. So the character area kind of combines those concepts of land use with that form-based approach that you've seen in some communities as they've implemented their general plan and carried it forward from a form-based code standpoint to implement that. The conventional approach, again, is fairly rigid, fairly prescriptive, very quantitative, and in some cases that's good, in other cases it's not so good. It's fairly rigid. It doesn't give you the kind of flexibility sometimes that you'd like to have as a commission and as a council, and so you have to take that and compare that appropriately. The character area, as Eric noted, is much more flexible. It's more qualitative. And again, in some cases, that qualitative approach and those characteristics are very beneficial. In other times, maybe not so much. The conventional is typically considered less business friendly. One of the reasons it triggers more major general plan amendments, as you know, they typically have to come through annually and are reviewed and considered by your council one time a year. So if you have an economic development project that's coming through that triggers one of those, it can be held up by that major amendment process using the conventional approach. The character area, because it's a more qualitative and you've collapsed your land use categories, typically it doesn't trigger those kinds of major amendments and is more business friendly, more economic development friendly. So kind of in a nutshell, those are kind of the compare and contrast from a verbal standpoint. If we were to go through, one of the things that we wanted to do again is apply it to the surprise geography. And so we took what I think is probably the most complex area in terms of what's going on for a 30-year planning area, roughly 100 square miles of your 308 square miles, and said, okay, so how do we apply this? The existing general plan, let's call it the base case, really identifies, you know, all of the land use categories you have, 2, 4, there's 6 residential categories, and they're, you know, 0 to 1, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, so fairly segmented across the board. You know, specific categories for landfill, specific categories for military, those kinds of things, specific categories for proving grounds. So you can see the mosaic that kind of takes place here in terms of the land uses. And so as we work through the different plans, we kept the land use colors the same because it makes it easier for you to kind of discern the differences with your eye in terms of how we're applying the different approaches here and those land use categories in particular. And we can work back and forth across this. So here's the conventional kinds of translation of conventional across the board. A few less land use categories. You can see the residential is down to 4 categories in particular. So you still see some differentiation there, but not quite as much as you had before. So there is some inherent flexibility associated with that. Commercial is basically just taken down to kind of a community or a regional level overall. You've got business park and industrial, typical demarcations on your industrial side of the equation, as you know. Mixed use category for where that applies. Certainly the open space corridors for the regional parks and the open space corridors that exist in this particular area. You know, military for the Ox 1 area, public facilities, where those happen on a major standpoint in terms of maybe high schools and things like that. Looking at resort opportunities from an economic development standpoint, you know, butted up against the white tanks on the north side there. And then proving grounds, you know, that's got a long-term lease, so to be able to call out that separately, you know, may have some benefit going forward. So we translate, you know, kind of go back and forth. There's a lot of different yellows and browns, you know, associated with this particular plan. A lot of differentiation around Ox 1 as well. So you go to the character area approach, and again, you know, it's almost like you're rising up another 50 or 100,000 feet. And so, you know, you got 3 residential categories, 1 mixed use, 1 commercial, 1 employment, and 1 military overall. And so in this particular case, you know, the flexibility is inherent here. You don't see any community commercial. That's inherent in, you know, the suburban and the urban residential designations, because with the character area, you're really relying not so much on the policies that you have with the conventional plan, but more design guidelines. And those design guidelines are something that Kevin will talk about a little bit more, but those design guidelines can really be applied to the different geography as they apply as you get down to the site level. Different kinds of buffering techniques where you have interface areas between the employment category and the residential category, just in particular. How do you respond to the adjacency of open space? Do you turn your back to it? Do you open up to it? What does that mean from a guideline standpoint? And so it's a way to apply the guidelines that kind of put the onus on the applicant, if you will, to kind of show how those guidelines take place and taking advantage of the unique characteristics on the properties themselves. And so, you know, you can kind of see that translation, you know, as we go back across. Here's where we are now, lots of different land use categories in terms of a mosaic, kind of winnowing it down a little bit more, and then ultimately, you know, for the character area, looking at it as something, you know, much more simplified. As we go across the board, certainly the city's been used to, you know, an approach that's policy-driven, land use plan-driven, and this is certainly a demarcation and a change from that. So from a kind of a training and kind of an education standpoint, there certainly would be a little bit of a build-up toward that end. One of the other tools that we thought would be beneficial tonight would be just to walk you through the land use designation definitions, kind of the crosswalk between them, if you will, you know, going from the character area to the conventional to comparatively where that applies to your existing general plan. So what we tried to do here was, you know, look at where those, you know, dwelling unit ranges are similar and where they demarcate a little bit or diverge. So generally, if you work from right to left, more categories on the right-hand column and collectively less as you work to your left. And so from a simplification standpoint, that certainly makes things easier to understand. Clearly, you know, you've got bigger ranges in your density, and that's where those guidelines can come in, because where you have bigger divergence in your density, you want those guidelines to help define and guide where those land use transitions take place, you know, where land uses should be located. Is commercial adjacent to the arterial? Does it help to buffer the residential kind of on the backside and those kinds of things? So this just gives you a crosswalk to kind of look across the board comparatively between, you know, here's the residential categories, you know, kind of going into mixed use. You know, each one of the alternatives have a mixed use category. That makes a lot of sense. And then as we get into the non-residential categories, and again, with the character area, you'll see that the community commercial is kind of built into the residential categories. And then there's some collapsing, obviously, that takes place, both with that and then as well within the industrial designations or the employment types of designations moving forward. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Kevin, who will talk about the comparison of the two approaches in terms of the component pieces.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And as Eric and John did a great job of, as John said, laying the foundation on the initial comparison. What this segment of the presentation is going to do is kind of take a deeper dive to really do a compare and contrast of the two different approaches on a few different indicators. And this slide illustrates exactly how we're going to evaluate them for you. Across three broad measures, the plan preparation, review, and adoption component, which is the process that we're currently in now, is the preparation of the general plan elements update, as Eric suggested. And then within that category, we're going to take a look at the existing general plan composition and style, public education component, edge treatment, which is a fancy way of saying what we're doing on our borders compared to our neighbors, Peoria to the east, Buckeye to the west, and Glendale primarily to the south. And then relationship to the other general plan elements that aren't slated for update. And how does that look and compare and contrast between the two different approaches? Plan administration and approvals. So this is looking forward, presuming that the plan is adopted in place, whether it's the conventional approach or whether it's the character area approach. From a staff perspective, what does the plan administration and approval look like? From a planning and zoning commission or city council perspective, what to take a look at with respect to those issues that you'd be confronted with on sitting at the dais. And then looking at major versus minor plan amendment definitions. And from the development community perspective and the process and procedure, how do they see through their the prism of their experience, if you will, the character area versus the conventional approach. And then, assuming the plan is adopted and in place, it's the implementation of the plan or changes that would need to occur And as you're fully aware, none of these plans are static. Most of the plans are fluid, and there's always a need to fine-tune and adjust for some form or fashion. But if you go to a character area approach, I think there's a certain element of a paradigm shift there that's going to require, necessitate or trigger a few more adjustments to the Uniform Development Code. What does that mean for CIP planning and budgeting for infrastructure improvements, master planning specific plan conformity, and the existing PADs that are on identified in the city already, which are, I think, 72 if I'm not mistaken. So we typically like to be more graphically rich than word rich, but the nature of this topic kind of requires to kind of go through on a graphic comparison in a word format, excuse me, just that side-by-side compare and contrast. So again, first one, plan preparation, review, and adoption. The conventional approach, it's fair to say that basically subtle modifications would be necessary. And if the community is inclined to go to the character area approach, that it's a different style and composition. None of them are insurmountable by any means. It's just the integration of the approach is a little bit different than the existing plan, and so you want to take a look at changes to the style and substance of the overall plan. How about from a public education standpoint? I think John touched on this, that the conventional approach is more intuitive. It's going to look more familiar to you, to the residents, to developers and their representatives that will be using the plan. Certainly those concepts are more familiar and therefore easier to grasp. To the contrary, the character area is going to require, it's an innocuous approach a little bit, as John pointed out, kind of takes you up another 50 or 100,000 feet, if you will, to use that metaphor. And it's going to require a little bit more additional training and education to comprehend and implement. But as Eric pointed out, there's other communities, excuse me, in the valley and elsewhere in the nation that have kind of migrated to that approach for different reasons. So the conventional approach from a public education standpoint, it's certainly focused on the traditional land use map, as John pointed out, and corresponding policy guidance that most all of us are accustomed to dealing with over the last few decades, quite honestly. Excuse me. The approach utilizes planning from a character area standpoint. It's a more form and function-oriented design guideline. So rather than being prescriptive, as Eric pointed out, kind of identifying land uses down to the nook and cranny, this one is having a general blanket approach, if we will, from a land use category, and relying on more form and function-oriented design guidelines to really define what that character is going to look like. How about from an edge treatment standpoint, when we're looking at, when you all in particular, staff and city council, are looking at development proposals, general plan amendments that are on the edge of the community, button up against Peoria or Buckeye, Glendale, whatever the case may be. Certainly at first blush, from a conventional standpoint, from a land use map standpoint, it's just quite honestly more simple, easier to visualize that consistency. You can look at a plan and say, okay, is it this residential, is it that residential, as compared to what's going on in Peoria, by example. The character area approach is a little bit more difficult to ascertain consistency with municipal plans because it's a more of a form and function-based exercise. So from that standpoint, on the second column there, or row, on the conventional side, it's easier to qualify and quantify the development for consistency on an evaluation of land use conformity only, which the communities I know that we've worked in, you kind of get caught into that trap, so to speak, and the private sector likes to, when they are evaluating a proposal that's in front of you, say, well, it conforms to the general plan because it's yellow, it's orange, it's brown, whatever that land use category is. Well, the determining what is consistent with the plan or not, from a character area standpoint, is a little bit more involved than just determining the stamp of the land use category itself. You review the form, the function, the transition, and the design guidance to ensure that it's the character that fits that area and is consistent with the quality and integrity of development and urban form that the city wants to see. How about the relationship to the additional general plan elements? Again, on the conventional approach, just simply put, there's some subtle modifications that would be needed depending on the breadth and depth of changes. And simply put, on the character area, there would be some additional modifications that would be necessary to a few of the elements that were not necessarily programmed to take a look at as part of this exercise, but cost of development, neighborhood planning, urban design, and conservation elements most likely would need to have some adjustments to those elements to correspond to the character area approach. So again, from a plan administration and approval aspect, okay, that's the perspective we're looking at now. So let's assume it's adopted. We're all working with this new tool in effect to guide the development in the community. So from a city staff perspective, the conventional approach is certainly more rigid and quantitative, as John pointed it out, in terms of evaluating the acceptability of a proposal. And conversely, the character area approach, there is more flexibility, and it's a little bit more qualitative than it is quantitative when evaluating the acceptability of a plan. On the conventional side of the house, there's certainly, in my mind at least, a certain lack of clear intentions when you're integrating land uses to determine what the look is going to look like. I sit on a planning commission myself and have done numerous presentations, as our entire, both your staff and your consultants. I think it's fairly clear that when you're looking at a general plan proposal, oftentimes you tend to boil down the essence of that proposal to the conformity of the land use category. What color ink is it on the map, and does it conform? And there's an argument or a school of thought that might be made that that's kind of a one-dimensional approach. Well, the character area certainly instills more dimensions into evaluating that for consistency, and it's looking, again, more qualitatively through requiring the explanation of the design intentions of that particular project, as opposed to, yes, we're gonna build 2 to 4 units per acre on residential housing. The application is going to have to go a little bit deeper to demonstrate pedestrian connectivity, different types of architectural and neighborhood styles, as opposed to just the simple land use blob, if you will, on the map. So, and the final, on number 3 there in the row there, is that on the conventional side, there's a reliance on policies that may suggest shoulds or mays. If you're familiar with that type of language and design guidelines, it leads to a little bit of implementation uncertainty, at least in my humble opinion, while in contrast, the character area approach results in a stronger comprehension of what the built form is going to look like, because that's indeed what the approach is prescribed to do. It's helping us to identify what that character in the urban form is going to look like. Again, continuing from a city staff perspective, number 4, the conventional approach is, as John again pointed out, little of these are a little bit repetitive, but it drills down a little bit more detail. That the conventional side of the house is a little bit more black and white, simply put, where the guidance reduces staff's interpretive ability to accept a proposal or an application the city desires, and then conversely, it diminishes the ability to deny an application that appears, at least by a sheer land use comparison, to conform with the general plan. So with the character area, which again is a little bit more qualitative, not quantitative, and perhaps therefore a little bit more subjective, it builds in an area of gray area that some people love to gravitate to, and the gray area makes some people nervous. So, but in that regard, it allows flexibility for staff in reviewing the development proposals and providing what you might have heard that term, kind of a safe harbor to accept the proposal a city desires and to deny a proposal that is not supported. And what do I mean by safe harbor? Safe harbor, Donna could explain it better than I, but simply put, it's more like a kind of a legal comfort zone, if you will, to base your decision upon. Number 5, the approach typically triggers more general plan amendments. John pointed that out. And what does that translate to? I mean, that's application is time is money. We've all heard that adage. And in the development community, that's very much a true adage that they live by and die by. And by virtue of that, it tends to be less business friendly. And conversely, the character area approach, while the application itself might have to be a little bit more intensive in terms of showing those design principles, it triggers less general plan amendments. And as you're familiar with, the major general plan amendment process can only be heard once a year. So if there's a proposal that the city desires, whether it's a job creator or the latest and greatest new slick master plan community with all the bells and whistles, if it triggers a major general plan amendment, it triggers a major general plan amendment, and they have to abide by that process. The character area tends to be a little less rigid in that regard. How about from the plan administration and approval process from the eyes of yourselves as planning commission members? The conventional approach, again, it's going to look familiar. As John pointed out illustratively in a graphic there, that the land use categories look pretty similar to what you have today. The character area approach, it's new concepts, it's new policy and design guidance. It's going to require a little bit more education and training of the concepts. On the approach side, in the second column, or excuse me, row there, that I've said the word rigid a few times, so I'll try to avoid that, but it not only reduces commission and council's interpretive ability to approve a proposal the city desires, but it also reduces their ability to deny one at the same time because of that rigid nature. Just like this particular comment is really a mirror image of what we discussed from a staff standpoint as well. It's universally applicable to the commission as well, the safe harbor approach and more gray area with respect to the character area. There's more flexibility there from the acceptance side or the deny side as well. How about major versus minor general plan amendments? And I know as planning commissioners, commission members, you're familiar with the concept that state statute kind of on both sides is really similar. Statutorily from the state, the city can pretty much define what it sees fit as what should constitute. What is that threshold from an acreage or a policy standpoint? What's that threshold from determining what is a major versus what a minor is? But just from a universal standpoint, the conventional approach tends to trigger more major and minor general plan amendments, and the character area does not. It's less rigid and triggers fewer amendments. So again, we're still on the plan administration approval aspect of reviewing this. How about from the development community perspective? I can tell you that the conventional approach from their perspective is, as we said, more rigid, time-consuming, and not necessarily responsive to the changing needs of the marketplace. And conversely, the development community would see the character area approach as more flexible, less time-consuming, and more market-friendly. Secondly, priority economic development projects can literally be held up in the major general plan amendment process. I think we've kind of beaten that horse enough there. And conversely, on the character area side, oftentimes those amendments tend to be minor in nature and can often be rolled in and processed with a zone change application, a PAD, whatever the case is. They tend to move through the process a little bit more exponentially. Thirdly, the application submittal requirements typically tend to be less extensive on the conventional approach. We talked about kind of that one dimension approach from a conventional land use standpoint. By and large, in most communities, and I believe including Surprise, you're looking at does it conform to the land use that's on the map, and of course, policy measures that support that land use category. But the application process itself tends to be a little bit less extensive because there's not as much to demonstrate conformity with. But conversely, on the character area side, while the development community would tend to favor it and find it more market-friendly and less rigid, there is going to be the application itself typically will be a little bit more extensive because they're going to have to demonstrate to you all and to city council and to staff those design measures to adequately demonstrate that it is the character for that area that is desired by the community. So, but at the end of the day, the developer would love to pay a consultant, whoever, a few more bucks to put an application together rather than wait for a year to go through a major general plan effort because the time is money. How about from a plan implementation standpoint? So now we're at the juncture where the plan is adopted, staff, planning commission, city council are working with the plan, and then as you know, the general plan tends to be the highest order policy and guidance document that a community has, and zoning ordinance provisions, design guidelines, and different regulations help implement the general plan. So I guess from a overall statement that a conventional approach, there's going to be moderate levels of adjustment. Like I stated at the onset, that these documents are not static. They're continually evolving with changing policies that the city wants to implement, changing market conditions, and so on. From an overall general standpoint, the conventional approach, you're going to have a moderate level of adjustment because you're sticking kind of with same as it ever was in terms with respect to the land use categories with some subtle adjustments that we would suggest at any rate. So changes to the corresponding Uniform Development Code and others are moderate. Where if you go to a character area approach, it is, I kind of hate the term paradigm shift, but in this case, that's kind of what it is from a general plan jargon standpoint. And as a paradigm shift, you're going to have more extensive level of adjustments that would be necessary to the Uniform Development Code. And those are kind of highlighted, at least some preliminary candidates, if you will, for changes in the second row there would be certainly definitions. That's one that's always changing. But development regulations in Chapter 3 and zoning and 5, the design in 6, and development review procedures in 7. But as I was talking with Lloyd before the meeting, you guys have a pretty good code in place. It's nothing that's insurmountable by any means, but the design guideline aspect of it would probably be the most frequent level of change, in my opinion. So how about from a CIP, capital improvement plan, infrastructure and budgeting standpoint, a vitally important aspect to municipal growth and development? The conventional side, I mean, just simply put, as Eric pointed out, he used the term nook and cranny. It's more prescriptive. You're going to have those land uses in a conventional approach are more prescriptive and dialed down to, I'll just call it the 25,000 foot level. And as such, there's more certainty and predictability when your planners, your engineers, and your public works officials are trying to identify what's the water line size that's appropriate to serve that density and intensity level. How big should the road be? What's the wastewater line sizing and treatment plant capacities? Certainly more certainty and predictability in the conventional approach, where in the character area approach, because there is broader categories, like John showed you in that kind of the crosswalk slide there. We'll take suburban residential by example, which is anywhere from 2 units to 8 units to the acre. That's a pretty wide variation of half-acre lots to 5,000 square foot lots. So when you're looking from a CIP infrastructure planning and programming standpoint, there are some additional assumptions have to be made in a character area approach as to, do we think it's going to be 3 units? Is it going to be 8? And the sizing of infrastructure accordingly becomes a little more complicated, but it's doable. It tends to be a little less precise, however. So how about if I'm one of your property owners and I have one of the 72 PADs that are approved and on the books in the community? I see Donna nodding her head over there. Yeah, how do we deal with that? That always tends to be kind of the juggernaut of how to deal with folks that love to hold up the paper and say, I have this level of entitlement, you can't change that. To a certain extent, that's true, but plans need to evolve with the times, and so does the development community needs to roll with that. So the first row up there in terms of the comparison of the conventional and the character area just kind of discusses what's out there today. You have, as best as our inventory can tell, 72 approved PADs that equate to about 140,000 dwelling units and a little over 7,000 acres of commercial and employment uses. And these PADs range in size from anywhere from a little 7-acre dude to 5,500 acres, all within various stages of development. So whether that's conventional or character, that's your existing condition. That's what you're administering on a daily basis. So if I'm in a conventional approach, I guess we don't know how to count one. We missed number 2 there, I guess. I just noticed that. Going down to the second row, land use categories are going to be similar to the existing general plan, where conversely on the character area, the land use categories are going to be different. I think we've discussed that ad nauseum. But what gets a little bit more interesting is that moving to says number 4, but it's the third row, that the potential in the conventional area, the potential for a modified mix, arrangement, and or location of land uses is there. And so it also is for the character area as well. So there's new land use categories that are likely to alter, again, the mix, arrangement, and or location of land uses that are approved in the existing PAD. Is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily, because if I'm going to jump down to the last column there, the last row, excuse me, that at the end of the day, and Lloyd and others, we've all been kind of espousing this from the get-go, is that a PAD is a certain level of vested rights. So we're here to say that there's not going to be a level of change to those densities or intensities that are approved that are on the books, but it is to say that the location, mix, and arrangement of those uses are likely to change. Maybe there's a new roadway that's identified that's going to give some PADs that are on the books a cause to say, hey, okay, this road alignment's going to be shifted. There's a new trail alignment. There's a new park that's identified. Mr. Developer, we're not going to change the number of units that you're approved on paper, but we are going to ask you to change the alignment of this roadway. We're going to ask you to incorporate this trail or shift. If your park was located in the northwest corner, and now we're saying it's the northeast corner, I'm using a hypothetical example, but you get the idea. The location, mix, and arrangement of uses are likely to change, or at least the opportunity for them to change is there. So that was a tremendous amount of words, way more than we typically like to throw at you, but that's the nature of this kind of dialogue. So what we thought would be the old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think a picture's worth a few thousand words in this example to kind of give you an illustrative example of how the two approaches would compare side by side. If you took a, I'll call this a 160 acre, a quarter section piece of property, a perfect square, you see on the left side that the conventional land use approach in your general plan or most general plans would look something like this, okay? Imagine that there's arterial streets on the outside edges of these squares, okay? So you'd have commercial on the corner, maybe you have some suburban level apartments, the high density residential, 15 plus units to the acre. A typical 2-story apartment complex is anywhere from 14 to 16 units to the acre, okay? So you can see that typical land use footprint from a general plan. Commercial on the corner, and then you transition from higher densities to lower density. Conversely, the character area approach, as John showed in the 100 square mile example that we did, if you took this slice of that and said, this is 160 acres, it has the designation of suburban neighborhood, 2 to 8 units to the acre. I think John also pointed out that it's inherently implied, or it would be through this tool that would help you create, that a 20-acre commercial property, say a Fry's anchored grocery on the corner with inline tenants, a bank, and a couple fast food restaurants, it's implied that that is an allowed use in the suburban residential, okay? And so what I want to show you kind of with this simple little animation is to say that rather than the prescriptive approach on the left with conventional land use where the commercial absolutely has to go on that corner, we'll call it the northeast corner, well, depending on what's going around, depending on development that's out there today, that's defining that character, or depending on the market conditions or traffic flows, maybe the commercial wants to be on that corner. Or maybe the commercial wants to be mid-block, if you can picture a collector road coming down the middle of that square, if you will, from the top. Or maybe commercial wants to be on that corner. This is what the character area allows. It's not static, prescriptive, and rigid like it is on the left to say, well, if your commercial is not on the northeast corner, upper right-hand corner, you're going to have to do some kind of major or minor general plan amendment, depending on acreage. The character area allows you to put the commercial corner wherever it best sees fit. Of course, it has to be approved by staff and you all, but the opportunity is there to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. Kind of drilling down one more in terms of building some of the more additional building blocks and defining the urban form on this hypothetical 160 acres. Maybe it's the commercial in the lower left-hand corner, surrounded by small lot residential. The school and the park want to be located there. Or maybe it wants to look more like this, depending on, again, what the character is. Maybe there's a neighborhood already built to the north and we don't want the commercial there. Small lot residential wants to be there. I think you get the idea that there's an opportunity to shuffle those same uses within that same, in this case, roughly 160 acres. So hopefully that helped illustrate that example a little bit better. So last couple slides, and I promise I'll hush up here, is that really what makes it tick at the end of the day, this character area approach, which it's not a silver bullet solution by any means. And there's ways, as Eric pointed out, to adjust a conventional approach to make it more business friendly as well, if that's what you're so inclined to do. But at the end of the day, each land use category will consist more of support districts. Okay, we can call them different terms, but by example, if you saw there was one employment category in your existing general plan, there's 4 or 5 categories that would fit with under the employment umbrella, if you will. But what would occur in those subcategories or those support districts, if you will, business park, corporate campus, research and development park, manufacturing and processing, warehouse distribution centers, those would all be permitted uses under the employment designation. And in the character area approach, you would have a series of form and function and buffering type of design guidelines to say, okay, if this area of the employment land use category wants or needs to be business park, these are some of the considerations that you need to consider in the design, as of corporate campus and research park and everything else. So those would be built into the process. So it's not just one blanket that says employment without any kind of definition. The definition, so to speak, would be built into the form and the function design guidelines. second large bullet point there, form, scale, and function community characters design tenets. The idea is to definitely achieve positive, what I like to call character-forming design habits that surprise desires, but it also gives you the flexibility to respond and integrate with the adjacent land uses and market needs of a particular development project. Kind of what I think we tried to articulate in that last slide with the animation there. And then the land uses and support districts integrate through proper design, transition, and buffering. And how do they do that? This is an example, at least, of some of the types of design guidance that would be supported in a character area approach. That would be, at least in our minds, a balanced and logical integration of those design guidance to achieve those kinds of places and spaces that are desirable and that Surprises wants to attain. And there would be, this isn't a one-size-fits-all by any means, but typically it would begin with some type of universal design guidance that would give some tenets that would speak to places that would be quality and enduring. What are those types of elements that Surprise consistently wants to see, regardless if it's a 10-acre community or if it's a 5,000-acre master plan, okay, at least on a residential front. Mobility and connectivity design guidance, which is vitally important, and certainly we know in our experiences here and that in some of the more mature areas, we get caught in the old, everyone's the walled-in community, and there's no way to get out. We want to be more creative and proactive and promoting communities with connectivity of all different modes, whether it's in your car, whether you're on a bicycle or you're on a skateboard, if you can get them off the video game, to walk and bike and those kinds of things, for neighborhood to neighborhood connectivity. Okay, that's throughout the valley. We're plagued with that problem throughout, and Surprise is no different. Trail and path mobility and connectivity, conceptual design element and easement conveyance provisions. And let's not forget about transit. We know that we're trying to enhance the jobs to housing balance and bring more jobs into the community. But for those like myself that need to commute, you want to have the ability to go from your neighborhood to the transit stop without necessarily having to get in your car to do it. Neighborhood design guidance, lot sizes, mixtures, buffering and transition principles, appropriate clustering options. Maybe not everything needs to be quarter-acre lots when there's natural resources, whether they're hillsides or key open spaces or washes. Maybe there's opportunities to have smaller lots and cluster those units to preserve open space for the residents to enjoy more proactively. And location, level of service standards for park sizing and programming, location of trails, parks, and public spaces. And last but not least, there could be additional design guidance. We just don't have any bullet points for them for public spaces and places, certainly commercial, business park, and industrial development guidance. And it's not that you don't have some of these already. You have some good solid building blocks in your design guidelines that we could integrate some of those principles into the character area approach with a little refinement, okay? So it's not a throw a baby out with the bathwater effect by any means. It's an integration and utilizing what you have in place already. So with that, some of the implementation considerations, I use that term paradigm shift. It is a new way of thinking. That doesn't happen overnight, and other communities before you have grappled with this as well. There's an emphasis on a stronger comprehension of what the character and built form will look like than the prescriptive application of land uses. That's one of the key takeaways we want to leave you with tonight. Eric had touched on supporting character area plans. Okay, so that's something we definitely want to underscore, is that with your 309 square mile municipal planning area, that's pretty large. With a character area approach, it's not going to be prescribed, again, down to the nook and cranny, as Eric talked about. There's opportunities to come in and for those key areas, I don't want to say key, maybe geographically important or significant areas, the White Tanks area, Lukox 1, Eric mentioned the Prasada, the OTS. There's an opportunity to come in and have a specific set of design guidelines and land form and function principles and policies specific to those geographies that would be more specific to those geographies. And that's very common, just as Eric showed you in Scottsdale. Mesa uses it, so does Chandler, and as do most cities, so does Phoenix. Update and modification of the Uniform Development Code and proper support. We mentioned that the PADs would retain approved densities and intensities. Just the location, mix, and arrangement of the approved uses could be adjusted when adhering to character area design guidance. There's less emphasis on future general plan amendments, more reliance upon collaborative design, and there's certainly more emphasis on demonstrating design principles in the future applications than perhaps what you see today. And to assist staff and to assist commission and council in the evaluation of a zoning request, we would certainly recommend that some type of zoning request, a consideration checklist for those types of character building principles be identified to help guide staff, yourselves, and council objectively for those considerations that come before you. We've thrown a lot at you, so we're certainly, staff and ourselves are available for some questions and hope to have a nice dialogue with you on comparing and contrasting the two different approaches.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question just as a global thing before we get into this. We also have a public hearing that we need to attend to before we start our deliberation here. And that is, I'm assuming that there's going to be an overlay map of some kind. Does the character, well, explain to me how the geographic component of the character and design guidelines is going to work. Is there going to be an overlay zone, I guess is the question.
From when you say Chair Summers, an overlay from the standpoint of like a zoning overlay, or you mean from a general plan vernacular?
A zoning overlay. In other words, how do we define where a particular, not density, but vision of how a building's, not how it's going to look, but whether it's a major corridor and you want higher buildings on it versus lower buildings, and that sort of character. How does that get defined geographically?
That's Chair and members of the commission. If I follow your question correctly, and forgive me if I don't, is that it's those design principles from a character area standpoint. And let me try to give you an example that, if you can picture the illustrative graphic, it would suggest that more intense intensities of uses, meaning building heights or floor area ratios, would be, and I'm being kind of universal here, applicable to closer to arterial roadways and parkways. And as you get away from those roads, you would graduate that density away, kind of like a transect planning model where you have higher intensity closer to freeways and high capacity roadway corridors. And as you transition away from those facilities, you would typically transition, you would lower the intensity and density of those facilities, those types of facilities. So the application of it would be, in a character area standpoint, let's say if it said suburban residential, you'd have those design principles when you had a zoning application come in that would refine the specific land uses within that development. The design principles would help identify, schools should be located with good access, central to the community design. Washes should be accessible, those types of things. So it's the design guidance that would help define that, if I understand.
If you're doing a subdivision area level of development, then I could see how that would work. If you have existing built environment and there's a parcel, how is that controlled?
Well, that's the beauty in my mind of the character area. If you have, let's say you have a square mile development next door, and let's say a developer comes in with a square mile that's vacant right next to it, certainly as staff and yourselves and council are evaluating that proposal, the character of that area, for good, bad, or indifferently, is at least somewhat defined by what is adjacent to it. So I think it would be logical to suggest that development proposal that you all are evaluating should react positively to the development that's across the street. So if it's multifamily, if there's apartments right across the street, you probably don't want to have large lot residential right next to it. You want to have something that gels with that or is consistent with that approach.
Okay, I see where we're going with this. So there won't be an overlay map that shows that kind of thing. And that was my basic question. So the guidelines would assist us and staff in deciding what is an appropriate
Absolutely.
use.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could go back and bring up one of the illustrations here, maybe with the character area approach. And one of them, you know, kind of getting to the discussion at hand, you know, every area within, and we'll just use this by example for the area that we identified just from a preliminary sense. You know, let's just take the area on the north side of the white tanks. You know, all of the areas would have an underlying land use, if you will. What there might be in some particular cases is an overlay in that particular case where it might be a resort designation as the overlay there. So in all of the geography, there'd be a land use designation, but that resort designation may be on the north side of the white tanks. It might be north of SR 74. There might be some very strategic locations where that overlay kind of floats on an area that tends to have some good characteristics that lend themselves to, say, a resort type of situation. Another case in point, like Kevin had noted for the OTS. The OTS will have a land use underlay over all of the OTS area, but that boundary for the OTS would have that overlay designating it as kind of the OTS area. And so I think there's some particular locations where that overlay designation might be applicable, but it's certainly something that we can talk with you further about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll add one more to that is, say on transit-oriented design. So let's say if Surprise is fortunate enough to have commuter rail along Grand Avenue and they become real transit stations. Well, the category might say mixed use, by example, or commercial in those nodes. But maybe there's to your point, Chair, is that maybe there's an overlay of sorts that says transit-oriented design principles would apply to the development of that area, which is unique to design of facilities that are around transit platforms and such.
And then the scenic corridor might be another opportunity as well.
Scenic corridor.
Thank you. I was just trying to find out whether there's a general overlay, and that you answered my question and also focused on we could have an overlay for specific areas if there's an appropriate need to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I would like to call the public hearing at this point. Opening the public hearing, seeing no one wishing to speak, close the public hearing and go to questions, starting with Mr. Chapman.
Thank you for the the presentation. I know it's a little overwhelming, frankly, to try to put this together. You know, there's people that are, I call them concrete sequential, or have something a little more solidified, like maybe our current plan. I'm very interested in the ideas and the flexibility, and there seems to be a little ambiguity on my part in trying to see how all this fits together, and what kind of training would take place with us, with the staff, in order to help us kind of get more focused on this.
I'll go first. All right.
Oh, don't fight for that much. No.
Oh, no. So yeah, it would basically, you know, so this is kind of, it's not necessarily the beginning of the process, but it's kind of, you know, where we're at in the process is we're looking at trying to get a preferred alternative. But over these next few months, we'll be taking this out to the public through multiple public meetings. So, you know, staff will be developing this plan with our consultants, and then we'll also be, you know, kind of briefing the Planning and Zoning Commission through this process and how it works out. So that it would be ongoing training. Again, we're looking at trying to bring this plan back to Planning and Zoning Commission for adoption in the November timeframe. So between now and then, we'd be coming back to you multiple meetings, kind of going through different components of the plan, making sure you're comfortable with the plan, and making sure that we're all comfortable together in implementing the plan. So that's kind of the education process.
And so basically, when we look at the timetable, we're talking about a series of time over several months?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a public meeting, I believe, on April 28th at Sun City Grand on these subject as well, and a stakeholders meeting as well. So, you know, we're still going to be doing multiple public meetings between now and then, and we can also bring it back to the commission once we start getting components and fleshing out the plan itself.
Yeah, I noticed that in I guess Surprise is unconventional. I was looking at the acreage for, and going back to the old. I was looking for the character types that we have and comparison land uses. I think it's the next slide up on this. The commercial land uses and residential.
Kind of the crosswalk between the land uses.
Well, I looked at the top, that's in the blue. You have rural neighborhood, 0 to 2 acres for character, conventional, 0 to 2, and then existing surprise general plan, 0 to 1. Now, I noticed that throughout the rest of the documents, it's got 0 to 2, and I was trying to think of character and livestock or horses on a half an acre, and you know how that could be arranged to make it work for those people that wanted to have such. I know that an acre seems to me a minimum, and I'm just looking at that conveniently. All the things after this point under character conventional approach say 0 to 2 acres. And I don't know, I don't want to get hung up on that. I'm just saying that in the design of a plan, is there some thinking of some benchmarks or something that we would have with any given territory or area? Or is it all going to be by design?
Well, I think a lot of that's going to be addressed through kind of your zoning ordinance as well, while you're using your zoning ordinance in association with your general plan. I mean, the 0 to 2, you know, and I understand you don't want to get hung up on it, is saying that horses and livestock are permitted. However, then when you go down to the zoning ordinance, it says, you know, horses are only allowed on 1 acre lots. But you still want to have some rural design elements, such as maybe if you have half acre lots, maybe you don't necessarily have to have sidewalks. I mean, I'm just throwing out, you know, throwing stuff at the wall right now, but you know, those kinds of things. If someone wants to, you know, live in kind of, I mean, there's a community out west that's got that irrigation type nature with bardages and so forth, and those people don't necessarily want all those public improvements, but they may live on a half acre lot that's adjacent to a 1 acre lot with livestock and horses.
And I guess I'd also say, you know, we're in the very formative stages of looking at this. You know, we're not pinned down in terms of what those density areas are. We're using 0 to 2 because it looked like half acre was a good place to kind of draw that line. If you folks feel like it's, you know, 1 acre and then it's, you know, 1 acre, 2.5 acre, 5 acre, you know, that's kind of the way you want to go, and then push everything down in suburban, you know, making that, you know, 2, you know, 1 and more or something like that. I mean, that's areas we could look at as well. Again, this is your plan. This is, we were just trying to provide a place to kind of pivot from to start with and kind of see what your input is, what the input of the community is. One of the things that's probably going to be happening here is looking at visual preferences. You know, what does the community think about, you know, when they see, you know, do they think half acre is rural or do they think half acre is suburban? You know, that's an area I think we still need to trek into a little bit more. We just wanted to give you an initial kind of prototypical crosswalk, but we can certainly toggle this a bit to make it, you know, unique to Surprise and what the folks here want to see. So.
I think part of the resolution of that is you're kind of sharing with me here as I was looking at things that are more flexible, more ambiguous, lead to different people's perceptions. And I was trying to think of legal matters as a approach with the developer who has a strong idea of what they want to do versus what the city would want them to do. And is this going to lead to more activity like in there, or do you think that things can be meshed easier? I know it's probably a little more concrete, sequential with the current plan, but it seems there's more flexibility with any character plan. So if you have any history here or knowledge, that'd be great.
Chair and Vice Chair Chapman, that's a great question, and it is a relatively new tool that communities have tried, and are trying, I should say, and I think the jury's still ultimately out somewhat, but I can tell you in talking with Mesa and Chandler and others that, and I think we used the word a few times, it tends to be a collaborative process, and in some respects it's a little bit, there's an element of subjectivity built into it. You know, what looks good to me might not look good to you, and vice versa. But it's certainly, because it is rooted in design principles more than the prescriptive land use per se, it necessitates that the process be more collaborative in nature, typically with the applicant and staff, as they toggle back and forth as to what's deemed appropriate. Maybe there's a little bit more adjustment. It gets to P&Z, and then as it moves forward to council. But to try to answer your question more head on, that I can tell you in Mesa, they've gone from, in 2006, they went from they don't have the number in front of me, 9, 10, or 12 major general plan amendments, now down to 0. So they prided themselves on being more of an economic development, business-friendly community to bring more jobs in. And Mesa's the third largest, I think, still third largest city in the state. And so they've made that leap of faith, and talking to their planning director there has not been more either threats of litigation proper, if you will. I mean, it's been a collaborative process that seems to be working well. But in fairness, the jury is still out a little bit because it's still relatively new.
I appreciate that, and I'm frankly very attractive to me to have the character approach. It gives us a little more flexibility in our decision making as well, and I think that would be appreciated, because there are some things that we have come before us that we would like to make some changes if we could. And I know that if we have a design element that has been negotiated through, that it would make it more desirable for us as well. So thank you for the question.
You're welcome.
Joanna?
Thank you so much for that. I also like the character approach. It looks really interesting and would, I believe, make our jobs a little bit, well, we'd have a little bit more flexibility, I guess you could say, looking at the lots and being able to utilize different things on that specific area. The one thing I was looking at is, I think I've said it over and over again. I don't know how many times yet. I still have yet to see it on any general plan. Is about 3 years ago, we did set wildlife corridors based out of the White Tank Mountains. Those need to be noted on there. Those are 1,000-foot wide. And if those are encroached on, we're going to have problems. So I think it was about 4 years ago. It was a while ago. Had more hair back then. So, that's one thing I'd like to see on there. And, I don't think that mixed use is going to go too well next to those things. But, I think there's definitely areas in there for mixed use, because, again, it's mixed use and we can do a lot with that area in there and make it more, it could make it mesh with the wildlife corridors that we do have in there. So they can work together. So basically, as I'm looking at this, is kind of, so basically if you're east of Reams Road, you're kind of out. So that's what I'm kind of guessing, right? Will this affect east of Reams Road? Or are we just kind of looking?
Oh, yeah, this was just,
Absolutely
yeah.
will. We just use this as kind of a vignette because it's only about a third of your planning area. So if you believe that this is an approach that you want to proceed with, this would be carried forth for the full 308 square miles.
I can't wait to see that.
This is only a third. We only wanted to tackle a portion of it to kind of begin with, and there's still some fine tuning obviously that needs to happen there.
And with regards to the wildlife corridors and the drainage corridors, if you look at the original general plan, most of them were left out. And one of the things that we've really tried to do through this process, working with Lloyd and so forth, is put those into the plan. And one of the things that the character kind of element allows us to do is that we do have a lot of planned area developments out in those regions. And as the example was, we're not going to touch their developable units, but at this point, we can start negotiating to try to get the connectivity of those wash corridors, trail corridors, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Push and pull.
Yeah.
Understanding, looking at the 303, coming down off that with the mixed-use commercial butted up against the urban high-density neighborhood, I guess you could say, right? Right. With the business, I guess that's existing Bell Road and 303. Really can't change much of that right now, or it's pretty much built out. But Is it possible, let's say, if we do go with with this type of character area land use, where it does have the commercial and on both sides of the 303 and the mixed use on both sides of the 303, if there's something else that comes along the way that actually is more of a mixed use, can you land swap? Can you move things around a little bit, like maybe move the commercial up, basically flip-flopping the mixed use or something along those lines? I mean, to me, it kind of looks, obviously you'd have to deal with the property owners, I would imagine. But is it doable? I mean, how much easier is it to do than what we have right now?
Well, so right now with your prescriptive uses, right now you kind of have mixed use over that whole area, and the mixed use component of the designation is pretty vague. What this does is it does allow you to swap and move things around relatively with those. So in the mixed use category, you'll have a commercial component, you have a residential component, and so forth. So you kind of play those uses against each other. And then even in the suburban neighborhood, you look at a definition where you'd probably have a small percentage of possible mixed use in that as well. So you'd be able to get there, or if it was big enough to really generate it, you could go through a general plan amendment process in this. What this does is allow you to be a little bit more flexible with your land use designations.
Perfect. I mean, the one thing it does do is it reads a lot. It's easier to the eyes than what we have right now. And I think it's a pretty neat concept, a really good concept actually. And hopefully, if this is something that does go through, it doesn't cause too much undue stress on staff to do all of this, because I know it's going to be interesting and a lot of work ahead. That's it.
Thank you. Commissioner Keating.
Thank you. Do you have any specific examples of some of the challenges that other cities have faced when changing from their existing plan to a new character area type plan?
Commissioner Summers and Commissioner Keating, specific with respect to what, the process itself, or
maybe not the process, but things that where, you know, really, I guess any kind of challenge that a city, a commission, the council has dealt with that maybe they didn't see coming ahead of time.
I'll try to be specific, but perhaps not as specific as you'd like me to be, is that by and large, universally, it has to come with the implementation tools and the changes of the design guidelines and the zoning ordinances to help support the character area, and dialing in at a finer grain level of detail on those changes and the process that goes with that, whether that's, I know the challenge sometimes is staff is spread thin, they're taxed, those are the things that tend to get pushed to the medium and back burner. So from a process and efficiency standpoint, those become a challenge. And so it's from an implementation standpoint, trying to stay on that and keep your foot on the gas, if you will, with keeping some momentum on those things and not letting that lag. So you make sure you have all the supporting cast of characters, if you will, or tools in place to support the character area approach. I would say universally that has been the largest challenge.
Maybe just to add, Chairman Summers, Commissioner Keating, you know, one of the things in terms of a proposal coming forth, you know, Kevin noted those design guidelines. Really, the burden of proof is going to be a lot of times on the applicant to show how their proposal complies with the guidelines that the city has adopted. And so their burden of proof is to show how their proposal complies with those guidelines. Staff's job is to basically trust but verify that those guidelines are indeed being met, and how so. You know, and I would say the only other area becomes, you know, this area where you have it's generalized in terms of land use between some of the residential and some of the employment categories. You know, how to in some of those areas that are suburban, how to provide, you know, kind of an employment base in those particular areas that is compliant and compatible with the residential areas, but also serves that market in there. And how do you protect those, you know, those employment areas, you know, going forward? So I'd say those are some of the, you know, administrative side, you know, keeping your eye on the ball and kind of monitoring as things go ahead. as Kevin noted earlier, from a quantitative standpoint, it's hard to quantify some of what's going to happen in maybe some of those square miles that are currently vacant. It'll be up to staff to monitor, how many dwelling units, how much population, how much employment is in there, because some of the finer grained master planning that's done, let's just say on the transportation side, to develop trips, how many lane widths do you need on the street, those kinds of things. And so it's not insurmountable. It's just something that needs to be monitored to make sure that, we get close to the mark in terms of what the population and employment is, how does that translate for, lane widths, capacity in sewer and water, acres of park and open space. So it becomes more of a monitoring thing. Again, not insurmountable, but just something that, continue to be checked by staff out on a going forward basis.
And with regards to those other tools, we're actually in the process of going through those tools. The goal is to actually bring you the revised SUDC, the Unified Development Code, around the same time that you're receiving this as part of the process. So that way they're all married together. We're also working with our engineering group to work with them on design guidelines and so forth. So all these different initiatives are kind of kicking off. And one of the things we're kind of holding on is once we kind of get some direction from the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, then we're really going to start rolling more into our SUDC update. That will be bringing forward as well, which will be going through public hearings and public meetings and so forth and stakeholders. So it's kind of all coming together right now. We're even in the process of looking at our existing development review process and how we can fine tune it and improve it. So it's kind of all coming at the same time.
Thank you. Commissioner Smith.
I have a couple of questions. Does the conventional approach give us more flexibility than the existing plan currently? And could we use, looking at the whole city, a lot of the cities developed, could we use certain areas designated as character areas and designate other areas of the city where we have a whole lot of building and a whole lot already planned and we're only infilling? Could we use those to be the conventional approach, using maybe the character areas for the area north out, the Prasada area, the white tanks, put the flexibility there and leave the rest of the city basically like it is?
That's something that the commission definitely can choose to do kind of a modified, approach where you have both.
Because we're really looking at just one little piece, which is pretty much an undeveloped piece here on the map. And if you looked at the rest of the city, it's pretty much a lot of it's built out. And do we want to go through and make the whole thing, or could we just designate areas that would be character to give us the flexibility at the tanks, the real key economic development areas, and put character zoning or character planning in those particular areas and leave the rest of the city? I'm talking about like a hybrid type thing.
Yeah, you can.
Which would give us, I think, as far as accepting the change, it would look like, okay, the city is already pretty much this way. We've got it planned and we've got all of the utilities planned out, and we've said, okay, we're going to have so many houses here, and then use it where we have to develop the newer areas of the city. Would that be feasible, practical? Was it thought about? I mean, right now I'm looking at just a piece of the city, and for me to say that's a wonderful thing, I'd have to look at a map of the whole city. And obviously we don't have that to say, where are these areas and, what are we really doing? So for me, I think that there's some benefit to the conventional approach, but I also think there's some benefits in the key area to use the character type approach. That would be my personal feelings.
Yeah.
So that's just my thoughts.
As we go forward, we talked about this example over in Scottsdale, and not that we're trying to copy Scottsdale or anything, but their character types and their character areas are defined throughout the entire portion of the city. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, but it might provide an opportunity, if you have an interest toward that side, dip into the Scottsdale website and take a look and see if does that get it done for you, or do you still like that hybrid approach going forward? So just a thought as to somebody who's done it before, and you know, how does that feel to you? If that's you know, does that feel good to you, or is it no? I don't think we're going that way. We really want to head this other direction. Just a thought.
Questions?
I have no other questions.
Mr. Chapman?
Yes. Just to follow up with an additional question regarding Commissioner Smith's question. Those things that are developed right now, if we were to let's say approve the character form, do we grandfather in those areas that are there? Do we take areas that are vacant and not developed and have them follow the current character approach, or do we go and let them, because I was just looking at this city, this acreage around our city hall that needs to be developed, and I really don't know that the conventional approach is one that I'd like to take personally. That's my own opinion. I'd like to have the flexibility for others. So I was not sure how we might approach this. Maybe, Eric, do you have any suggestions?
Well, you know, with existing development, and the reason I pull up the Chandler map is when Chandler actually used to have a very similar general plan land use mechanism as the city of Surprise did, but they went fully to this type of mechanism, even though there was already developed areas. Those developed areas are, you know, when you start looking at kind of the proposal for the character area, there is some developed areas within this plan. One of the reasons we chose this area is because we had vast areas that weren't developed. We had an interface with the white tanks. We had the 303 corridor. So we had kind of the play of almost everything that you could see in the city. And if you look with the 2 to 8 units in some of the areas, that still protects that neighborhood character for those existing developments. What you can also do too is, when we talk about similar to kind of what, you can look at the plan in Chandler, is you can create those areas of special plan. Well, I can't call them special planning areas, but those specific areas that you want to start doing specific plans for, like the 303 corridor, like the white tanks, and you can kind of designate those on the map as future areas of study that you can dive into further. So you can have a little bit of both within just the character area plan as well. But either way, it would protect the existing development. Now, if a commercial corner or something like that was already designated under zoning and so forth, they would be able to move forward because they were included in this plan. So it's not changing necessarily what they can do on existing development. It's more or less kind of it addresses kind of both, some redevelopment issues and some of the undeveloped areas.
No question.
Thank you.
Mr. Harder?
So basically, the existing areas that may have a little bit of development and not a lot of development, we could look at those areas and I wouldn't say modify, but address certain things that reshape the landscape to be more appealing or appeasing to the public. Is that kind of what we're saying?
That's kind of the idea, is that this is one of those tools in that toolbox that you can help do that with, by providing some flexibility through the general plan process, and then diving down further into more of the design elements, looking at how we can work with the developers to basically the carrot and stick type mentality, where we really want to see this in this area. How do we help? How do we facilitate this type of development over there, by maybe an increase of density versus building a park or a trail corridor, those kinds of things. So that's the idea through this type of mechanism.
So basically all the dirt west of Reams, per se, up to the 303, basically from Waddell down to Cactus, I guess it is. So that would be I got to count streets here. Greenway, Thunderbird. So basically, it'd be the yellow running into the urban neighborhood, right? In between those two, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, that would kind of be the first area that would be impacted. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm just trying to figure out how this is going to work. You know, it's taken that, obviously this land is already purchased and we kind of know what everything that's going in, playing inside there, but how is it going to end? If you plot this right now, the way it looks, are there going to be anybody up in arms? The landowners that already may have PADs, or, you know, the way it's zoned? Are we good?
Well, so, you know, this is still a process. You know, these are lines on the map at this point. We're still going out to the stakeholders and going to have that, and we're still going to go through the process where there's probably going to be some adjustments where these yellow and red and purple blobs are, so.
But this is also going to give developers maybe a little room to breathe and go, well, you know, I actually had an idea that I really wanted to do this, but unfortunately I'm not going to spend the money to go through and rezone and redo everything all over again, right?
Money and time, yeah. And then I think Donna had some.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I think there might be a little bit of confusion about how the zoning and the general plan interplay here, because if you'll remember, all zoning has to be consistent with the general plan, but the existing zoning, as you change the general plan, they still have the same rights under their zoning. It's as Eric had described, it's more of a bargaining chip, because if they would like to change what they're doing, they won't have to go through a general plan amendment. They may have to change their zoning, or they may have the flexibility to make other alterations under their existing zoning. But we're not changing anything on the ground,
Right.
and we can't by changing the general plan.
Right. It just gives more flexibility to the developers or the landowners themselves to be able to make a change without having the pain and the heartache of doing that.
But also remember that you have other alternatives for that as well, because the city defines what is a minor general plan amendment as well as what's a major general plan amendment. And we've got it established right now in the general plan. But if you don't like the way it is, if you think that we are maybe having too many opportunities or too many necessities for major general plan amendments, we can change the parameters. You have the total control, the city has the total control over defining what is a minor general plan amendment and what is a major general plan amendment in the general plan.
But, okay, so, but if let's say we did adopt this, council adopts this, we wouldn't have to go back to general plans, major or minor general plans to do stuff.
Well, that's not.
It'd probably be a little rarer, but.
It will be more rare, but that isn't, you know, things
Right.
change over time. Someone may want.
Nothing's for never.
Nothing's forever, that's right.
So, and again, you know, this is kind of, this is still going to be getting a lot of public input. We're still going to be looking at where these, you know, these land use categories, and maybe there's different land use categories that we look at as well, you know, so it's up in there at this point.
Mr. Chapman?
Yes,
Work in progress.
Eric, we are looking down here at three different options here. One, to continue the way we're going. One is to adopt a character approach plan or a combination thereof. You're our leader. You're going to be the cheerleader. Is there any particular plan that you think might benefit the district from your perspective?
I have a preferred alternative.
Did we hear it?
Is your preferred alternative on this piece of paper?
It's on that piece of paper. So I put on, I'm by trade, I'm an economic developer. I like flexibility, and I like be able to go and talk with developers and, you know, try to negotiate. With what we want, and this is just my opinion, with what we want to create in the city, and how we want to drive jobs and how we want to create open space and trails and parks and so forth. I really prefer the character area plan. I think it gives you so much flexibility and allows us, and you know, and really actually allows our staff to do their job, as opposed to just basically going in and going, okay, well, your commercial corner's there, your mixed use is right there, and then your high density is next to it, and it matches exactly. Then, you know, you get the stamp of approval. In this case, our planners go out and they say, you know what, let's see that development application. we need some commercial in this area. How can we work with them to facilitate that? Granted, zoning is what zoning is on the ground. But I think in the general planning sense, when you're starting to take a look at some of your future development areas and where you're trying to go, I really like this as kind of us working with the developer in more of a collaborative effort.
It's a partnership.
Yes.
So you're saying the middle one, huh?
Well, and the character area, but also defining those areas where we really want to go in there and look at special area plans and so
But
forth.
existing structures and everything else that's already zoned or already constructed is basically already covered under the conventional and traditional. I mean, they're in, and it's not really a grandfather. I mean, they're done, so it doesn't really. They're just going to get a color put over them.
Yeah.
Right.
And really, that color is probably going to be fairly consistent with what they have in the first place.
Right.
Thank you. I'd like to do a little poll to see, in deference to Mr. Smith's concern about dealing with existing zoning and sort of bifurcating this. I know that I'm seeing a couple of people that sound like they're full on for the character. We'll take Mr.
One more quick question. If we have to play with two zoning or two, if we do the mix, we're looking at having to deal with two land use maps on our 2035 master, right?
To a point, I think you can identify certain areas where you go in and you just designate it. But you are creating kind of two different type of mechanisms in the same map, or you can create two separate maps. That's what Scottsdale did. One of the things that we have currently in our SUDC is we have a character pattern map and we have a zoning ordinance map, or zoning map. And you have to use both maps to get to the point where you actually can, tell someone what you can do on their property and the setbacks and kind of the design, not necessarily a design, but, what you can actually do on that property with way of setbacks and so forth. And personally, I'm not a big fan of that. It's something that we'll be looking at through the SUDC update, but you're kind of doing that a little bit if you go that route with this plan as well. You need to look at either both mechanisms or the combination of one on one sheet.
Are we taking out some of just the free market decides what goes on a particular piece of property by using character? Because then really the city staff does count the planning and zoning. I mean, if you really looked at free market, if it's zoned commercial and I fit the parameters, and I know all of us here have voted for projects that fit the parameters that you held your nose, but sometimes the free market is a better judge than maybe we are as far as what should be on a particular piece of property, because they're the person making the investment. And if they think it's the best idea and best use, then maybe the marketplace should make some of those decisions.
And Commissioner Smith, I would argue that on the character area, it allows that free market flexibility to be able to do that, because you're not necessarily saying the commercial needs to be here, the residential needs to be there, and it has to be.
But you also could be saying we don't want that here, and that would give us the flexibility to say we don't want that particular. So you would be taking away some of that.
No, it gives you and staff so much more flexibility in making decisions.
So it would take away some of the free market ability to decide what goes on a particular property and give that to the city staff, planning and zoning, the commission, the city council, to some extent. So, like I said, I'm kind of in favor of some type of a hybrid where we designate those areas where we really want to plan the city and have the flexibility to do it right, the tanks, the Prasada area, some of the areas out north. And basically the rest of it, I don't know whether we really need, other than most of it's done anyway. But do we really need to go in and maybe we could take our focus and work on those specific areas and drill down and really try to get those areas the way we want to see the city? Because those are the key areas. Does it have to be every corner that we decide whether we like that project or not? Or could we say, in these areas, we want them developed the way we want, the city wants, and the rest of it, let the market decide what goes on that corner? I don't know. That's just my thoughts.
Any comments? Do we want to have a motion, or do we want to talk about what the motion should be first? Or are we ready to go?
I'm
Make
ready
the
to make a
motion.
motion.
Okay, I recommend to the mayor and city council to create a new recommended approach to character area approach for the city-initiated major general plan amendment, general plan elements update as a basis for updating the land use plan for the city of Surprise.
Second.
Please vote.
Motion passes 4 yes votes, 1 no vote.
Thank you. Anybody want to add any future agenda items? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.